Investment Review in Vietnam. The workshop is held by MPI and UNDP. Ladies and gentlemen, perhaps until now, the word climate change sounds very familiar at the top priorities of many countries in the world, including Vietnam, because climate change is not a problem faced by any country, and it is a global issue, and Vietnam is not an exception, and climate finance is very critical in responding to climate change and implementing net zero emission target and other goals that Vietnam has committed in COP26. So the mobilization, planning, and use and monitoring of investment and expenditure for climate change should be conducted in order to ensure the climate financing alignment with important strategies like green growth strategy and climate change strategy and NDC. In order to analyze the level of expenditure and public investment for climate change and the alignment between climate change policies with climate change priorities and green growth, MPI has conducted a review on climate public expenditure and investment. The first review was in 2011 and 2014 with the support of UNDP and the World Bank. And next, following the first review, MPI together with UNDP conducted and finalized the CPEIR report for the period 2016 and 2020 with the participation of many ministries and provinces, including 6 ministries, including MART, MOTRE, MOT, MOIT, MOC, MOST, and 28 provinces and 1 city of Cần. And with that significance, I am honored to introduce the attendance of distinguished guests in our workshop from MPI. I am honored to introduce Ms. Nguyễn Thị Bích Ngọc, Vice Minister of MPI. I am honored to introduce Mr. Lê Viết Anh, Director of Science, Technology, Education, Natural Resource Environment Department at MPI. From UNDP, I am honored to introduce Ms. Kathleen Wilson, UNDP Resident Representative to Vietnam. And we are honored to extend our welcome to all participants, representatives of line ministries, DPIs from provinces and cities, development partners, and media agencies who are here to broadcast the news of the workshop. And once again, welcome to all of you. Ladies and gentlemen, our agenda and the workshop is held in person in Hanoi, and which is broadcast live through UNDP social media. And welcome to all online participants, and I hope that you can deliver the messages from the workshop to the entire community. And now let's get started with the opening remark by Her Excellency Ms. Nguyễn Thị Bích Ngọc, MPI Vice Minister. Ms. Kathleen Wilson, UNDP Resident Representative to Vietnam. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, please allow me to be on behalf of MPI. I would like to be on behalf of MPI to extend our thanks and warmly welcome all participants representing line ministries, local international organizations, representative of embassies, UN agencies, experts, for your time to join our today's workshop on climate public expenditure and investment review of Vietnam. As you know that being one of the country which is very vulnerable to climate change and natural disasters over the past many years, Vietnam has made remarkable efforts joining international community efforts to respond to climate change and to foster economic development to ensure improved life for the population, and especially COVID-19 pandemic has evolved over the last couple of years, negatively affect and extensively affect all walks of life and social life of the population and the world economy, as well as Vietnamese economy has faced a number of challenges, especially for the post-pandemic recovery. And in this context, Vietnam is more aware of the importance of maintaining the achievements of development, as well as important developments of development in connection with adaptation and mitigation of climate change, and with the role of the advisory body to advise the government on the finance resources for climate. And MPI is deeply aware that the development and planning and budgeting for implementing program strategies and targets to respond to climate change is quite critical. With that approach, the CPEIR report was developed in order to further look at the expenditure and public investment for climate change from local funding as well as from ODA, in order to enhance the efficiency of budgeting planning for climate change response during budgeting, resource allocation and planning. The 2020 report looked at the public expenditure for climate change in 6 ministries, including MART, MONRE, MOT, MOIT, MOC, MOST, and 28 provinces, and one centrally run series based on the expenditure for the period 2016 and 2020, and some additional analysis for the 2015 report, and through the review of policies and institutions for climate change. Our report showed that the 3 issue groups, first in terms of policies and institutions, Vietnam respond actively to climate change challenges through promulgation of series of policies and national programs on climate change, as well as integrating the tasks and requirements of climate change response in SCDP strategies, 10-year, 5-year SCDP plans. And the second issue group are adaptation mitigation measures to climate change can be enhanced, contributing to implementing successfully the NDC for the period 2021 and 2030. And finally, we found that the public expenditure and investment of provinces compared to their overall budget account for 2 to 9%, and ministries' budget account for 26 to 38% of their total budget. Ladies and gentlemen, with these findings, the report's findings can be used for assessing in order to enhance the climate change response capacity of the public public finance system, and promoting shifting from input-based to output-based financing, and to facilitate the policy intervention for climate response at ministerial and provincial and local levels. And this shows the efforts of fulfilling the international commitments of Vietnam in responding to climate change, as well as investment requirements for climate change, and then to serve the basis for mobilizing resources and diversifying the financing for climate change. And the 2015 report and the 2020 report shows the necessity of a monitoring and reporting system on expenditure and investment for climate change, and we should be integrated in the planning and budgeting, and shifting to monitor the climate expenditure and investment, and improving awareness of the community as well as the businesses, and promoting the engagement of relevant stakeholders in order to increase the public expenditure efficiency for climate change, especially during the planning and implementing the 10-year strategy for the period 2021 and 2030, and to help you use effectively the report's findings by sectors. And now presentations by experts will provide you with multidimensional findings and very valuable findings from the report. And last but not least, on behalf of MPI, once again, I would like to extend our thanks to line ministries, local international organizations, NGOs, development partners, and UN organizations in Vietnam for having supported MPI to develop and finalize the report. And on this occasion, I would like to extend our thanks to UNDP for providing technical assistance during the development, finalization, and launching of the report. Once again, I wish all of you good health, and may I wish a great success to the workshop. Thank you. Thank you, Her Excellency, Mr. Thị Ngọc, Vice Minister of MPI. And now I am honored to invite Mr. Katalin Waysand, UNDP resident representative, to deliver the welcome remark.
Your Excellency, Ms. Gwynthi Bích Nop, Vice Minister of the Ministry of Planning and Investment, distinguished representatives from ministries, provinces, development partners, UN organizations, media agencies, and colleagues joining us both in person and online. Ladies and gentlemen, Xin Chào, good afternoon. I am very pleased to be joining Vice Minister Nop in welcoming you all to the launch of this long-awaited report, Climate Public Expenditure and Investment Review. The launch of this report is occurring at a very important time as well as Vietnam starts implementing the new 10-year Socio-Economic Development Strategy and 5-year plan, as well as a new roadmap for green and inclusive recovery. UNDP is honored to be deepening our long-term partnership with the Ministry of Planning and Investment, key ministries and provinces in the CPEIR exercise, together with many other projects and initiatives to accelerate and enhance green growth and climate change actions to achieve sustainable development goals here in Vietnam. As we know, climate change is already here, it is already happening. Temperatures are rising, typhoons and droughts are occurring more frequently, rainfall patterns are shifting, and the global mean sea level is rising. Vietnam has already witnessed successive floods, historic storms, and droughts in the central region and Mekong Delta in 2020, 2019, 2016. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, in his concluding statement at the COP 2016 in Glasgow last September, warned that in our fragile planet is hanging by a thread, and we are still knocking on the door of climate catastrophe. The government of Vietnam has recognized the threats posed by climate change on the country and has continued to update and introduce new policies and plans on green growth and climate change. At the COP26, Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh made ambitious and highly commendable commitments, notably the national target of net zero emissions by 2050. And most recently, the government has established, in immediate follow-up, a new national steering committee for the implementation of Vietnam's commitments at the COP 2016. Ladies and gentlemen, new and additional climate finance is essential for addressing the impacts of climate change. In 2009, developed countries promised at least $100 billion a year to support the developing world in reducing emissions and adapting to climate change by 2020. Unfortunately, that target has not been met. A recent report by the OECD concludes that in 2019, only about $80 million in the climate finance was provided out of the 100 billion out of the 100 billion needed. In this context, climate vulnerable developing countries such as Vietnam have already and continue to increase their own budget for climate change adaptation and mitigation. However, greater global efforts and support are required to scale up investment in adaptation, as highlighted in the recently launched IPCC Adaptation Report, which some have called a damning indictment of failed global leadership on climate. This is additionally emphasized in the UN Secretary General's statement that adaptation and mitigation must be pursued with equal force and urgency, end quote. Achieving optimal outcomes for climate finance investments requires robust planning, budgeting, tracking, and reporting processes, as well as maximum alignment of the budgets and expenditure with strategic priorities in climate change and green growth strategies and plans. To evaluate Vietnam's efforts in responding to climate change through its budget allocation, resource mobilization, and alignment of expenditure with climate priorities during the period of the 10-year Socio-Economic Development Strategy of 2011 to 2020, MPI and UNDP have conducted 2 climate public expenditure and investment reviews. The first climate public expenditure review was launched in 2015. The CPEIR report, as we call it, and that we launched today, will also serve as a basis for estimation and allocation of state budget and mobilization of international climate finance for the new 10-year period of 2021 to 2030. The CPEIR that we launched today provides a full picture of investment and recurrent expenditure with domestic resources in ODA over the period 2016 to 2020. It takes a snapshot across 6 ministries. These are the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment, the Ministry of Transport, Ministry of Industry and Trade, Ministry of Construction, and Ministry of Science and Technology, as well as 28 provinces and the centrally managed Kanto City. Shortly, you will be hearing more detailed findings and recommendations from the speakers and experts. However, I would like to take this opportunity to provide some key highlights for discussion. First, the report shows that Vietnam has increasingly allocated its own financial resources for climate change response. A total budget and expenditure of the 6 ministries and 29 provinces and city was almost $6.5 billion, or an average of $1.3 billion per year during the period 2016 to 2020. The average climate budget of the 28 provinces and 1 centrally managed city also increased steadily by about 53%, from about $700 million in 2016 to almost $1.1 billion in 2020. The climate change budget represents a relatively stable proportion of the total provincial budget, varying between a significant 16 to 21% of the total budget. While the domestic budget allocation was stable, ODA tended to increase. Among the provinces, An Giang has emerged and showed the steadiest trend, with a climate change-related budget increase from under $4 million in 2010 to over $60 million in 2020, or a significant 15-fold increase in budget. The investment climate change budget in An Giang has increased faster than the overall provincial budget, and this is significant. Secondly, among the 6 ministries reviewed by the CPEIR, the climate budget of Ministries of Agriculture and Rural Development and Ministry of Transport account for about 80% of total climate finance, and these are mostly focused on infrastructure for irrigation and transport. Thirdly, the other finding is that adaptation is the dominant expenditure of the climate change budget, representing over 70% of the budget for ministries, the climate change budgets of ministries, and over 90% of those for the provinces. This is also consistent with policy priorities for public investment, whereas mitigation expenditure is mainly drawn from the private sector. However, the climate change adaptation budget has not yet been sufficient to address Vietnam's full needs and climate risks. This is very important to underline. Fourthly, the report shows that there are opportunities for better alignment of climate budget with climate change and green growth strategies. It is indicated in the report that not all the expenditures could be linked into policies. For instance, only 77% of the climate investment budget for ministries could be tracked in the National Climate Change Strategy's actions. Therefore, the CPEIR can be used as a vital instrument for ministries and provinces to assess their recurrent expenditure and investment baseline against key climate change and green growth priorities so that they can adjust and improve policies for greater climate change impact. Ladies and gentlemen, moving forward, I would like to share two recommendations. Firstly, the climate change and green growth strategies and their action plans should be reflected in objectives and targets of policies and plans of sectors and provinces, as well as in the overall socio-economic development plan. In effect, the 5-year socio-economic development plan will reflect climate change priorities with estimated financial resources and direction for allocation for climate change budget to ministries and cities and provinces. Secondly, there is a need to systematically integrate climate budget coding and tracking into the planning and budgeting processes. This will enable consistent, systematic, and transparent tracking and reporting of the financial and technical delivery of climate change commitments as required by the Enhanced Transparency Framework and Reporting under the UNFCCC. In addition to the investment and recurrent expenditure at the central and provincial levels, off-budget public expenditure and possibly private investment in climate change should also be integrated in the system. In conclusion, and I would really like to take this moment to express our thanks. The CPEIR could not have been undertaken without the support and the contribution of the participating ministries and provinces through a comprehensive process of data collection, analysis, and consultation. We would like to take this opportunity to extend our sincere gratitude, our great appreciation to the Ministry of Planning and Investment, and particularly to all 6 participating ministries, 28 provinces, and Kanto City, as well as to the individuals who have enabled and contributed to the fruitful CPEIR that has led to the launch of this important report today. We look forward to a very open, frank discussion at today's workshop and to our continued collaboration for the enhancement of climate change financing and responses to achieve Vietnam's sustainable development, green growth, and climate targets that leave no one behind. Thank you for joining us, and I wish the meeting great success, a fruitful exchange, and I wish everybody here present and online great health, stay safe. Thank you, Sim Kamun.
Thank you, Ms. Kathleen Wyson, UNDP resident representative to Vietnam. Ladies and gentlemen, the CPEIR report in Vietnam, as well as the launching workshop today, once again show the great efforts of Vietnam together with UNDP in particular and other development partners in general in implementing climate policies and to help you to have the overall picture about the report. And now I would like to invite you to view a video clip about the summary of the report. Thank you.
Báo cáo rà soát đầu tư và chi tiêu công cho biến đổi khí hậu, thực hiện đánh giá chi ngân sách nhà nước cho biến đổi khí hậu của 6 bộ, bao gồm Bộ Công Thương, Bộ Giao thông Vận tải, Bộ Nông nghiệp và Phát triển Nông thôn, Bộ Tài nguyên và Môi trường, Bộ Xây dựng, Bộ Khoa học và Công nghệ, 28 tỉnh và thành phố Cần Thơ. Báo cáo bao gồm chi đầu tư và chi thường xuyên ngân sách nhà nước và hỗ trợ phát triển chính thức trong giai đoạn từ năm 2016 đến năm 2020 và một số dữ liệu về chi ngân sách nhà nước giai đoạn 2011 đến 2015 của 5 bộ và 3 tỉnh. Dữ liệu phân tích cho thấy chi cho thích ứng biến đổi khí hậu là chủ yếu, chiếm hơn 90% ngân sách cho biến đổi khí hậu, phù hợp với các ưu tiên chính sách của đầu tư công. Trong khi đó, chi cho các hoạt động giảm nhẹ chủ yếu từ khu vực tư nhân. Ngân sách cho biến đổi khí hậu trong giai đoạn từ năm 2016 đến năm 2020 của 6 bộ ổn định, chiếm khoảng từ 26 đến 38% tổng ngân sách của bộ. Bộ Nông nghiệp và Phát triển Nông thôn và Bộ Giao thông Vận tải chiếm phần lớn ngân sách cho biến đổi khí hậu với khoảng 80%, phần lớn dành cho hai nhiệm vụ biến đổi khí hậu, bao gồm thủy lợi và giao thông vận tải, chủ yếu là cơ sở hạ tầng. Ngân sách biến đổi khí hậu trung bình của 29 tỉnh, thành phố tăng đều trong khoảng thời gian từ 2016 đến 2020 và chiếm tỷ trọng tương đối ổn định trong tổng ngân sách của tỉnh, khoảng từ 16 đến 21%.
Ranging from 16 to 21%, and climate budget of provinces focus on specific actions, for example, food and water, sea level rise, and forest development. And climate budget is aligned with NCCP and also aligned with NCCS and the task to implement a Paris Agreement. That's why it should be advised so that it can be better aligned with the budget and climate policies. Information from CPEIR report can be used in order to ensure the alignment between the budget priorities with the policy, climate policies in the public finance, and in order to increase climate actions. The monitoring and reporting of climate expenditure is very useful for revise and supplement climate policies and to mobilize the resources and priorities, and it provides directions, and it should be integrated in the 5-year SCDP, and expenditure for climate should be monitored and reported on a systematic manner by project proposal at ministerial and provincial level, and they should be build capacity on green growth, climate and climate finance in order to establish and implement climate finance monitoring system. Ladies and gentlemen, with a short video clip, you can imagine the fundamentals of the report and the findings and recommendations of the report. Later on, we'll be hearing experts presenting. And now, in order to keep memorable moment when we launch the report, I would like to invite participants to the stage for the group photo. Thank you very much. I would like to invite all participants to the stage for the group photo. Thank you. And please be seated. And next, we would like to introduce Mr. Nguyễn Thị Bích Ngọc and Mr. Kathleen Wilson to co-chair the workshop. Thank you. Next, I would like to invite Her Excellency Mr. Nguyễn Thị Bích Ngọc and Ms. Kathleen Wilson to co-chair the workshop.
Okay, thank you all very much. As we see, this video clip shows us the brief results and recommendations from the CPEIR. And to share more details about the findings, results, and recommendations of the report, the representatives of the research team will present to you the methodology, the results of the budgetary analysis for climate change, and the link between climate change budgets with policy priorities and plans, as well as recommendations. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Mr. Jeremy Hills. He's an international expert in climate finance who will present the climate finance and overview of the CPEIR approach and methodology. And I believe Mr. Jeremy Hills will be presenting virtually. Is that right? Yes, Jeremy, over to you.
Yes. Thank you very much. And I would like to welcome MPI Vice Minister and UNDP Resident Representative, and all other colleagues and representatives from various organizations. I'm speaking to you, I think, on behalf of a very large group of people, including the UNDP team that has been involved in this work for the last few years, and also from the many provinces and ministries that we have engaged with in this work. So this is a culmination of many people's involvement to achieve what we have done here and pull together all of this information on climate finance into one report. So thank you to everyone who's been involved, particularly during a difficult time of COVID, where it has not been helpful to engage with some of the stakeholders involved. So I'd like to talk a little bit just about the methodology that we have used and the approach to try and understand this large sort of complicated system of climate finance that we have reported on in the CPEIR. The methodology is quite technical, as you can imagine, to pull all of this information together. But if we break it down into stages, maybe the first stage was to review the policy, particularly in relation to national development and climate change, and then the budgeting process and how that process worked. Secondly, we collected the budget data that we needed from the ministries and from the provinces. And then we carried out a systematic analysis of that data, which includes coding and review of the information provided. Thirdly, we produced what we call a folio, which is a description of the climate budgets of the 6 ministries and 29 provinces or centrally managed city that we looked at. And then from that information, we combined it together to provide the overall picture of all of the ministries and provinces that we looked at. And then we link that to the policy instruments that we've heard described already, the National Climate Change Strategy, the Viet Nam Green Growth Strategy, and also the PEIR, the Paris Implementation Plan. And finally, from that, we've come up with some strategic recommendations for MPI and the wider government out how to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of budgeting climate finance. The methodology we used was based on the CPEIR that was produced in 2014. However, we are aware that MPI produced guidelines on climate tracking and recognition of climate finance in 2017. And it's probably worth just at this stage to compare the CPEIR of 2014 approach with the MPI guidance of 2017. And there are a number of differences, and maybe one of the most significant one here is that in the CPEIR of 2014 approach that we used, we looked at investment and recurrent information, whereas the MPI approach focuses on investment only financial information. In the CPEIR approach, we also looked at task codes. So each budget line could only be within one task code, whereas in the MPI approach, you could have multiple tasks for each budget line. And the total project budget that we had was weighted by climate change in that not all of the project budget was related to climate change. So we weighted the total project budget by the amount that was related to climate change. And this was done slightly differently in the MPI approach. And the third one that I'll mention here probably that's important is that we did our analysis based on single project budget lines. So we were provided with a budget title and we used that for the analysis. The MPI approach uses much more information and unpacks that information and understands that information through project documents and other studies. So the CPEIR is done on less detailed information compared to the MPI. And the CPEIR also uses a slightly different typology for coding of the different activities that the projects are undertaking. And the approach that the CPEIR took is adapted from the World Bank, which was used in the 2014 CPEIR, whereas the MPI approach is more closely linked to the policies that are implemented for climate change. So there are a number of differences. Probably the most important is that the CPEIR approach we have used can look at investment and recurrent financial flows, and that we can undertake this analysis with just a single budget line and title, as opposed to having to go to the project documents of each individual project. So there are the differences, but we basically followed the CPEIR of 2014 methodology. And when we get a budget line, we basically follow four main steps. The first step is to determine if that budget line is related to climate change expenditure. And we have a definition of climate change that we use to see if there are climate-related expenditures within that project. Step two is based on the activities that are carried out within that project and determining where it fits into the climate change typology. So we have a set of activities or sectors into which each of these projects fits. So we put it into that typology. Step three is to determine whether the main activities are focused on adaptation or mitigation. So adaptation is building resilience to the impacts of climate change, and mitigation is reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, the net greenhouse gas emissions, to combat climate change. And then step 4 is this weighting procedure to determine what part of the overall total project budget is related to climate change response. And so this was our 4-stage methodology for coding and for extracting the information from each project. And as been mentioned by the introductory speakers, we covered 29 provinces or central city managed provinces with data from 2016 to 2020. So that was our core data set for provinces. We actually had, from the CPEIR of 2014, additional data for 3 provinces. So we could look at these provinces for a longer period of time, from 2010 to 2020. And for the ministries, we looked at 6 ministries from 2016 to 2020. But for 5 of these ministries, we had data from the previous CPEIR that we used. So this allowed us to look at the 2010 to 2020. So the Ministry of Science and Technology was not established when the previous CPEIR was carried out. So we included that in the 6 ministries that we studied in this report. Obviously, this is a technical process, and there was a number of challenges in carrying it out. And I would just highlight 2 challenges. Firstly, to get all of the data together was quite a challenge, and there was a few bits that were missing in the final data set because it was difficult to extract this data. And that's partly because this data is not clearly tracked and identifiable in the ministries. You have to go and find the data from the larger pool of projects and investments in those ministries. So extraction of the data was challenging and took quite a long period of time. And the second main challenge was about the coding system, particularly in relation to transport. So the typology we used has a coding called transport, and this was mainly coded in our data set as adaptation rather than mitigation. This is a large component of the overall budget. For example, about 40% of the ministry budgets are related to transport. So this is a large area, but this coding of transport didn't capture the variety of transport. So this could be road, it could be maritime, it could be related to air transport as well. And it didn't really clearly distinguish between the adaptation and mitigation aspects of transport. So it wasn't a particularly useful coding for the advancement that has been made in Vietnam in relation to investment in transport. And when we look at policy, we find in the climate change strategy and the green growth strategy that the transport aspect is really only mitigation based, whereas a lot of the transport we identified was adaptation focused. And in PEIR, the implementation of the Paris Agreement, there's no specific transport coding. So we have this slight discontinuity between the transport coding in our typology and the policies that are being implemented. And so if this is carried out again, there's very much a need to revise and review this particular transport coding, which makes up quite a lot of the overall budget being targeted at climate change. So that was the second challenge that we really had. In the full report, the structure of it is tried to be laid out in a logical way. Firstly, the first chapter looks at the policy in relation to climate change and national development, the planning and budgeting processes. Then chapter 2 looks at the methodology that we used in terms of, it gives a full description of the typology and the coding and the definitions that we used. Chapter 3 then elaborates the provincial budgets from the 29 provinces and centrally managed city. And it gives an outline of how much is being spent on climate change, which areas of climate change activity is being spent, and also how much of the overall provincial budget is being targeted at climate change. Chapter 4 gives a similar profile, but for the 6 ministries, how it's changed over time, how much of its proportion of the overall ministry budget is going to that, which activities is it focused on, and how that's changed over time. Chapter 5 then looks at the relationship between climate change budgets and national policies. The 3 national policies we considered: the climate change strategy, the green growth strategy, and the plan for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And we tracked our climate finance onto these different policies to see which objectives had significant amounts of climate finance associated them, and which objectives of those policies had less. So we tracked the finance onto those policy objectives or strategies or outcomes of those policies. And then finally, in chapter 6, we make some recommendations that can be taken on to help advance the efficiency and effectiveness of the climate finance, and also thinking about how it would be easier to undertake this sort of analysis more easily in the future through tracking. And the final slide that I will talk about is the folios. So for each of the 29 provinces and the 6 ministries, we have an individual sheet or folio which provides an overview of their climate budget. And this is structured with an introduction to the province or the ministry, the overall budget, which is broken down into domestic or ODA sources, and the percent of the overall budget that the climate finance makes up, the breakdown of the budget in relation to its focus on adaptation mitigation, or a mix of adaptation and mitigation, the allocation of the budget to climate change delivery. These are concrete climate change actions, as opposed to preparatory actions, which could be policy or science and technology based actions. And then a look at the main ODA projects that are supporting that province or ministry, and then the review of the policy instruments that that province or ministry has in place to allow support and actions in those projects. So for each of these 29 provinces and ministries, the report provides a folio or sheet on each of them, which gives these sort of details. And maybe this is the first time that this has been done at this sort of depth, to understand what's happening in each of these important institutions, which overall constitute the response to climate change. Thank you very much. That's all I'd like to say, and back over to the project organisers. Thank you.
Xin trân trọng cảm ơn ông Jeremy Hughes.
Thank you, Jeremy Hill. As you just heard, Jeremy Hill just presented a summary report that will be launching today. This report used the methodology presented by Jeremy Hill, and the data was collected from 6 ministries and 28 provinces and 1 city. And the report provided very valuable findings on the investment and public expenditure trend over the past 5 years. And now I would like to invite Mr. Vũ Cương, representing the local expert team, to present about the further analysis. And Mr. Vũ Cương, please. Thank you, Mr. Viet Anh. Ladies and gentlemen, and following the presentation on methodology, as well as the data set and challenges in data collection that our expert team faced. And next, I would like to be on behalf of the local expert team to present to you about the trend in investment expenditure for climate change using data from 6 ministries and 28 provinces and 1 city. And my presentation is corresponding to chapter 3 and 4 of the overall report. For the details, please refer to the full text report. And in my presentation, I would follow the general logics. First, we look at the trend of ministries' budget allocation, and then I would present about provincial budget for climate, and then I only present the general trend, but for the details of budget allocation of each ministries and province, you can refer to the data in the annexes and the folio of each province and ministry. You can have the details of that in the folio. And for ministries' budget, as you may see, we collected data in 6 ministries, including the MART, MONRE, MOT, MOIT, MOC, and MOST. The data of 5 ministries from the last period, from 2010 to 2016, were available but not complete. That's why our analysis focused on the period 2016 and 2020. The first trend we can see in the picture is that from 2016 to 2020, you can see that climate budget of ministries during this period varied from 8,000 to 13,000, or 26 to 38% of total ministries budget in 2016. This proportion was 33% and highest in 2018, 38%, and in 2020 it accounts for 26%. That is the general trend. But now look at the structure of the climate budget of ministries. On the screen, you see that we split into 3 groups. The dark green is expenditure for adaptation, and the light gray is expenditure for mitigation, and the orange combined expenditure for both adaptation and mitigation. And look at the data through various years. A very consistent trend is that climate budget primarily focuses on adaptation. and through exchanges with ministries, I think that it is logical and aligned with the national policy priorities, especially expenditure for mitigation is disbursed by the private sector. So when we analyze about public expenditure, I think that the picture seems like that adaptation expenditure from public expenditure accounts for smaller proportion. 90% budget is focused on climate change response, and the 10 remaining percent is spent for science, technology, and policy and governance. And from 2016 to 2020, the major expenditure was for adaptation, and the remaining is equally disbursed for mitigation and combined mitigation and adaptation. And if we go on further analysis, we can see that the expenditure structure by ministries, by the expenditure task, and we see that on the screen, we break down the expenditure on different sectors, for example, transport, irrigation, or for other sectors. We can see that the two predominant expenditure, that is expenditure for transport and irrigation. Data show that expenditure for adaptation focus on the two key tasks, that is irrigation and transport. Each task accounts for 4,000 billion per year for the period 2016 and 2020, and these two tasks are representative to relevant adaptation actions of ministries who has the largest climate budget, that is MART and MOT, and other tasks which are non-irrigation and transport account for 17% of the adaptation budget during the same period. And this task is widely distributed to adaptation, and with the expenditure is higher, 10 times higher for irrigation and transport. And the task that receive the largest budget is risk mitigation. And for example, the risk mitigation task or rural development, food security, and construction of a river and sea dike system, and that is the budget allocation by ministries budget. And next one is a provincial budget for climate change response. So the picture of provincial budget look pretty similar to the budget of ministries. Average budget for climate change for researches is about 18,000 billion VND, but we can see that this level of budget keeps increasing year-on-year basis. So, and especially in 2020, this figure increased to 20,000 VND, whereas this figure in provincial climate budget keeps increasing, and for domestic funding stabilized over the years. So the increasing budget attributable to ODA. So this shows that ODA funding increased from 24% in 2016 to 46% in 2020. And vice versa, domestic funding stabilizes during this period. So due to the increasing ODA, that's why the contribution from domestic budget would decline from 76% in 2016 to 54% in 2020. So expenditure for climate change accounted for 20% of provincial budget. Even in 2018, it was a bit lower, and ODA investment increased rapidly. That's why the climate finance in the total provincial budget remain the same. So in 29 provinces, we can see that ODA proportion in the total provincial budget is increasing, and and look at the structure similar to the pictures from the Ministries budget. We break down budget by 3 action: adaptation, mitigation, and combined adaptation and mitigation. And for provincial budget, the proportion of adaptation is larger for expenditure of adaptation by ministries. So 90% of provincial budget is for adaptation, and the remaining budget for climate change from 6 to 10% is distributed for adaptation and mitigation. And investment in mitigation is dispersed readily, but accounting for a small proportion from 1 to 2% out of the total climate budget. And the final trend we can see that here is that provincial budget allocated to different tasks, and the graph shows that major expenditure for climate change is disbursed for adaptation to climate change, and expenditure for governance, science, and technology accounts for small proportion. So, and expenditure for adaptation here, you can see that 99% of the total budget during this period includes many actions, and it is spent equally among actions, and for major actions receiving 29 billion VND, including transport, accounting for 14.5% of the total budget for climate, and then which is followed by resilience of residents and cities, and this bar accounting for 14.1%, and then irrigation, and finally the expenditure for embankment, riverine and coastal embankment or dike construction, and expenditure for mitigation is spent for coastal protection, water quality, rural development, food security. We receive 1 or 2,000 billion VND per year, and the smaller portion from 5 million to 1 billion is spent for governance, solid waste management, prevention of salinity, forest development, disaster management, and the task for energy efficiency, social services, biodiversity conservation, or energy generation, with the distribution of less than 1% from the climate finance. So in general, through analysis of data from ministries and provinces, we can see that there are some major similarities of budget allocation between ministries and provinces. So expenditure focus on mainly on adaptation, and expenditure for adaptation, we see that expenditure for irrigation and transport account for significant proportion, and the remaining proportion ministries spent for other actions is lower, 10 times lower than other actions, and provincial expenditure is equally dispersed for other actions, but focus on increasing resilience of cities and water management, rural development, agricultural production, and riverine and coastal dike construction. So those are the analysis of the trend of the public expenditure that we analyze in our CPEIR report. Thank you for your kind attention, and that's it for my part of the presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Vu Quang, for that very interesting presentation. And in addition to the analysis of climate change budget trends, the CPEIR also analyzes the links between the climate change budget and the policy and strategy priorities on climate change, green growth, and the implementation plan of the Paris Agreement on climate change. And here I would like to invite Mr. Koos Nefis. Please excuse me for the pronunciation. I know Koos as Koos because he's worked many years and he's a well-known expert in this area. We're delighted to invite Koos to now speak to us on climate change, and he'll present the analysis, results, and recommendations to strengthen the review and reporting of public expenditure and investment on climate change. Koos, over to you.
Thank you very much. I am very happy to also be here, and we are here in this room with three colleagues of the researchers. You have seen Jeremy, but I also want to point out that there are more. I would like to talk a little bit about the policies and the links between the data that you have just seen and the policies that existed over the period 2010 to 2020, and in particular the period 2016 to 2020. So I will not talk about policies that have since been formulated. We talk about the old Viet Nam green growth strategy, the old national climate change strategy, etc. Oh, that is the wrong direction. The last one. Okay. So here are the three key policies that you have already heard everybody speak about and that we have analyzed. The National Climate Change Strategy, the Green Growth Strategy, and PEIR, the plan for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. I also need to point out that we have also looked at the action plans that fit under these strategies. We have looked at the sector action plans, we have looked at provincial action plans. So we have seen all of that. In addition to those three and the analysis that we are presenting now, we have also looked at some other action plans, or you could say strategies and policies at provincial and ministerial level, on forestry, on disaster management, etc. But that is not what I will present here. In the report, you will find some references to that. The first is to look at the ministerial level. As Jeremy was pointing out, we had a challenge in the methodology that was used in 2014 and that was also used by us now, in particular with regards to transport. That challenge means that you see here that 77% of the data that Mr. Kuhn has just presented fit, that they fall under or connect to the National Climate Change Strategy that you are seeing here. This difference of 23% is primarily explained by our need to remove much of the transport expenditure that Mr. Kuhn presented from this part of our analysis. It was labeled by us, by the data collectors, as adaptation in many cases, whereas in policy, most of the transport actions linked only to mitigation aspects. The National Climate Change Strategy budget was dominated by strategic action on food and water, as you can see here on the slide. This is unsurprising, 58%. Much of that is irrigation in the typology. The second largest was CC5 on greenhouse gas emissions, or about a quarter of the climate change strategy related budget, including forestry, which actually is about both adaptation and mitigation. Finally, about 18% of the climate change strategies budget or linked budget was dispersed across the remaining strategic areas. So we see this clear dominance of irrigation here as well. If we look at the green growth strategy and how it links, the percentage that we could map onto the green growth strategy is lower yet again. This is understandable for, first, the same reason that we have quoted on transport, But second, the green growth strategy is not only about climate change. It is partly about climate change. And so therefore there is a necessity for it not to be 100% climate change related. It is not any form of criticism. It is the observation that on the one hand, the green growth strategy overlaps to a degree on mitigation aspects with the climate change strategy. It does not do as much of that with regards to adaptation actions. And thirdly, it has other green actions that have been financed, but we have not analyzed them. If you look at PEIR, at the plan to implement the Paris Agreement, that same percentage goes down yet again. Jeremy already pointed out that in this plan, we do not find much transport, which is about 40% of total ministerial level expenditure, as well as a very large chunk of the expenditure at the provincial level. But I'll talk about the province in a minute. This is largely about the implementation of the national program on climate change and green growth. That is the very large chunk, PEIR 21, that you see here on the screen. Other expenditures were allocated to other national programs, in particular on forestry, disaster management, and fishery. It's not moving. So, yes, now we get to the province, but I am too fast. So on the provincial level, it is a very similar story. On this slide, you see the provincial pie chart, and at the bottom right, you see the equivalent pie chart that I just presented about the 6 ministries. In this case, we will see that the link between provincial policies under the National Climate Change Strategy, so for example, in the Provincial Action Plan on Climate Change, we'll find that about 90% of total climate investment budget could be tracked into this climate change strategy related actions. That is a very significant amount of finance, as highlighted by Mr. Kuong. Most of this allocation was again to food and water and sea level rise, meaning again infrastructure under the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development. The remaining budget is divided fairly equally between other strategic actions on forestry, as well as greenhouse gas emissions reduction, community capacity, and disaster preparedness. The distribution, as you can see from the small pie chart at the bottom right, is a bit different between the provinces and the 6 ministries. On the green growth strategy, again, we are comparing the impression you get from the expenditures at provincial level with the trends that we have observed in the ministerial level, and here the differences are smaller. Climate investment budget could be tracked on about 45% of green growth strategy related expenditures in green growth action plans at provincial level, for example. This reflects again the taking out of the adaptation tasks related to transport. The province's targeted budgets at only 9 out of 17 of the Viet Nam green growth strategy solutions, as they are called. These solutions with the highest expenditure include sustainable infrastructure again. Other categories that received also significant allocations are linked to agriculture and agricultural emissions, sustainable urbanization, and sustainable lifestyles. It is important to observe that the actions that we observed in the budget expenditure analysis of provinces are comparatively practical. They are fairly concrete. No. On PEIR, or I should say the action plans at provincial level for implementation of the Paris Agreement, the link to the policy is at about 72%, which again is less than one would expect because of the transport methodological issue, it is similar in structure to what we have observed with the ministries, in it that most of the expenditure links to the National Program on Green Growth and Climate Change. The largest allocation is again similar to what we have seen linked to agriculture in particular, irrigation and so on. So what does this lead us to in a quick summary? We have analyzed these links between provincial and ministerial budgets and climate change and green growth plans, and we have, for provinces, also made a couple of case studies. These case studies provide the reader of our report with insights into how well the match is, and sometimes there are some imperfections that can be observed, which should be potential lessons for provincial and also ministerial policymakers taking a look at what happened in the past in order to formulate better policies for the future. We have clearly seen a focus on adaptation across the ministries and the provinces, with relatively small expenditures from the public purse on greenhouse gas emissions reduction, which is consistent with policy. Policy does allocate that task primarily to the private sector. Finally, there is a question around a certain prioritization of expenditure. Is this what the country, what the province, what the ministry wants in terms of the prioritization of expenditures? That leads me to 4 recommendations, the first 2 of which you see on the screen here. Our first recommendation is to mainstream climate change and to strengthen planning with climate change resources. You have already heard references to the 2017 MPI guidelines for a change in our methodology, but we believe that further look is required to the methodology in order to produce guidelines for integrating climate change plans. Climate change strategies and actions integrated also important into the SEDP, the Socio-Economic Development Plan and sector plans. That methodology that I referred to is important for the second recommendation, the systematic or tracking and reporting on climate change budget and expenditure. We propose to incrementally develop this monitoring and reporting capacity for climate investment, including investment expenditure and recurrent expenditure, so both, as we have observed in the 2014 methodology, integration of public expenditure at the central and the provincial levels, and possibly consider to also monitor private investment in climate change. And the final 2 main recommendations are to use these results efficiently. That means to conduct regular such in-depth research for a detailed snapshot, and to focus on sectors with the biggest efficiency improvement potential. Where can most gains be made to do better on climate change adaptation and mitigation with the limited resources available? And use this as a basis for mobilizing and diversifying, for mobilizing more money for highly targeted, focused activities. Finally, capacities need to be strengthened at different levels on both climate change policy and on the management of finance, including with officials in ministries and provincial people's committees, provincial departments of planning and investment, and maybe others, such as, of course, the ministry and provincial department of finance. Strengthen sector responses to climate change in sector ministries is also important. And in provinces, awareness of the links between vulnerability planning and budgeting is important. The rollout of our proposed climate change tracking system is potentially promoted through various capacity building workshops. Xin cảm ơn.
Yeah, thank you, Ku Lifif and presenters. I think that we are a bit behind the schedule, but I think that we break for coffee for 10 minutes. We reconvene at 3:30, and now we break for coffee. Thank you. So now we would like to invite, we break for coffee, and we will reconvene at 3:50. Yeah, we'll continue with the second session. Thank you.
Báo cáo rà soát đầu tư và chi tiêu công cho biến đổi khí hậu, thực hiện đánh giá chi ngân sách nhà nước cho biến đổi khí hậu của 6 bộ, bao gồm Bộ Công Thương, Bộ Giao thông Vận tải, Bộ Nông nghiệp và Phát triển Nông thôn, Bộ Tài nguyên và Môi trường, Bộ Xây dựng, Bộ Khoa học và Công nghệ, 28 tỉnh và thành phố Cần Thơ. Báo cáo bao gồm chi đầu tư và chi thường xuyên ngân sách nhà nước và hỗ trợ phát triển chính thức trong giai đoạn từ năm 2016 đến năm 2020 và một số dữ liệu về chi ngân sách nhà nước giai đoạn 2011 đến 2015 của 5 bộ và 3 tỉnh. Dữ liệu phân tích cho thấy chi cho thích ứng biến đổi khí hậu là chủ yếu, chiếm hơn 90% ngân sách cho biến đổi khí hậu, phù hợp với các ưu tiên chính sách của đầu tư công. Trong khi đó, chi cho các hoạt động giảm nhẹ chủ yếu từ khu vực tư nhân. Ngân sách cho biến đổi khí hậu trong giai đoạn từ năm 2016 đến năm 2020 của 6 bộ ổn định, chiếm khoảng từ 26 đến 38% tổng ngân sách của bộ. Bộ Nông nghiệp và Phát triển Nông thôn và Bộ Giao thông Vận tải chiếm phần lớn ngân sách cho biến đổi khí hậu với khoảng 80%, phần lớn dành cho hai nhiệm vụ biến đổi khí hậu, bao gồm thủy lợi và giao thông vận tải, chủ yếu là cơ sở hạ tầng. Ngân sách biến đổi khí hậu trung bình của 29 tỉnh, thành phố tăng đều trong khoảng thời gian từ 2016 đến 2020 và chiếm tỷ trọng tương đối ổn định trong tổng ngân sách của tỉnh, khoảng từ 16 đến 21%. Ngân sách biến đổi khí hậu của các tỉnh được tập trung cho các hành động cụ thể như lương thực, thực phẩm và nước, mực nước biển dâng và phát triển rừng. Ngân sách biến đổi khí hậu gắn với các hoạt động của chiến lược quốc gia về biến đổi khí hậu, cao hơn ngân sách gắn với các giải pháp của chiến lược tăng trưởng xanh và các nhiệm vụ của kế hoạch thực hiện thỏa thuận Paris. Do đó, cần điều chỉnh để gắn kết tốt hơn giữa các kế hoạch và ngân sách biến đổi khí hậu. Các thông tin của báo cáo rà soát đầu tư và chi tiêu công cho biến đổi khí hậu có thể được sử dụng nhằm đảm bảo sự phù hợp giữa ưu tiên ngân sách nhà nước với chính sách về biến đổi khí hậu trong hệ thống quản lý tài chính công và tăng cường các hành động liên quan đến khí hậu. Việc theo dõi và báo cáo chi ngân sách nhà nước cho biến đổi khí hậu rất hữu ích cho việc sửa đổi, bổ sung các chính sách về biến đổi khí hậu và huy động tài chính khí hậu từ các nguồn khác nhau. Các ưu tiên trong các chính sách biến đổi khí hậu với dự kiến tổng mức đầu tư và định hướng phân bổ ngân sách nhà nước cần được lồng ghép vào kế hoạch phát triển kinh tế xã hội 5 năm. Chi ngân sách cho biến đổi khí hậu cần được theo dõi và báo cáo một cách có hệ thống bởi các đơn vị đề xuất dự án ở tỉnh và bộ. Các cán bộ cần được tăng cường năng lực về chính sách biến đổi khí hậu và tăng trưởng xanh, cũng như tài chính khí hậu để thiết lập và triển khai hệ thống theo dõi tài chính khí hậu. Báo cáo rà soát đầu tư và chi tiêu công cho biến đổi khí hậu, thực hiện đánh giá chi ngân sách nhà nước cho biến đổi khí hậu của 6 bộ, bao gồm Bộ Công Thương, Bộ Giao thông Vận tải, Bộ Nông nghiệp và Phát triển Nông thôn, Bộ Tài nguyên và Môi trường, Bộ Xây dựng, Bộ Khoa học và Công nghệ, 28 tỉnh và thành phố Cần Thơ. Báo cáo bao gồm chi đầu tư và chi thường xuyên ngân sách nhà nước và hỗ trợ phát triển chính thức trong giai đoạn từ năm 2016 đến năm 2020 và một số dữ liệu về chi ngân sách nhà nước giai đoạn 2011 đến 2015 của 5 bộ và 3 tỉnh. Dữ liệu phân tích cho thấy chi cho thích ứng biến đổi khí hậu là chủ yếu, chiếm hơn 90% ngân sách cho biến đổi khí hậu, phù hợp với các ưu tiên chính sách của đầu tư công. Trong khi đó, chi cho các hoạt động giảm nhẹ chủ yếu từ khu vực tư nhân. Ngân sách cho biến đổi khí hậu trong giai đoạn từ năm 2016 đến năm 2020 của 6 bộ ổn định, chiếm khoảng từ 26 đến 38% tổng ngân sách của bộ. Bộ Nông nghiệp và Phát triển Nông thôn và Bộ Giao thông Vận tải chiếm phần lớn ngân sách cho biến đổi khí hậu với khoảng 80%, phần lớn dành cho hai nhiệm vụ biến đổi khí hậu, bao gồm thủy lợi và giao thông vận tải, chủ yếu là cơ sở hạ tầng. Ngân sách biến đổi khí hậu trung bình của 29 tỉnh, thành phố tăng đều trong khoảng thời gian từ 2016 đến 2020 và chiếm tỷ trọng tương đối ổn định trong tổng ngân sách của tỉnh, khoảng từ 16 đến 21%. Ngân sách biến đổi khí hậu của các tỉnh được tập trung cho các hành động cụ thể như lương thực, thực phẩm và nước, mực nước biển dâng và phát triển rừng. Ngân sách biến đổi khí hậu gắn với các hoạt động của chiến lược quốc gia về biến đổi khí hậu, cao hơn ngân sách gắn với các giải pháp của chiến lược tăng trưởng xanh và các nhiệm vụ của kế hoạch thực hiện thỏa thuận Paris. Do đó, cần điều chỉnh để gắn kết tốt hơn giữa các kế hoạch và ngân sách biến đổi khí hậu. Các thông tin của báo cáo rà soát đầu tư và chi tiêu công cho biến đổi khí hậu có thể được sử dụng nhằm đảm bảo sự phù hợp giữa ưu tiên ngân sách nhà nước với chính sách về biến đổi khí hậu trong hệ thống quản lý tài chính công và tăng cường các hành động liên quan đến khí hậu. Việc theo dõi và báo cáo chi ngân sách nhà nước cho biến đổi khí hậu rất hữu ích cho việc sửa đổi, bổ sung các chính sách về biến đổi khí hậu và huy động tài chính khí hậu từ các nguồn khác nhau. Các ưu tiên trong các chính sách biến đổi khí hậu với dự kiến tổng mức đầu tư và định hướng phân bổ ngân sách nhà nước cần được lồng ghép vào kế hoạch phát triển kinh tế xã hội 5 năm. Chi ngân sách cho biến đổi khí hậu cần được theo dõi và báo cáo một cách có hệ thống bởi các đơn vị đề xuất dự án ở tỉnh và bộ. Các cán bộ cần được tăng cường năng lực về chính sách biến đổi khí hậu và tăng trưởng xanh, cũng như tài chính khí hậu để thiết lập và triển khai hệ thống theo dõi tài chính khí hậu. Báo cáo rà soát đầu tư và chi tiêu công cho biến đổi khí hậu thực hiện đánh giá chi ngân sách nhà nước cho biến đổi khí hậu của 6 bộ, bao gồm Bộ Công Thương, Bộ Giao thông Vận tải, Bộ Nông nghiệp và Phát triển Nông thôn, Bộ Tài nguyên và Môi trường, Bộ Xây dựng, Bộ Khoa học và Công nghệ, 28 tỉnh và thành phố Cần Thơ. Báo cáo bao gồm chi đầu tư và chi thường xuyên ngân sách nhà nước và hỗ trợ phát triển chính thức trong giai đoạn từ năm 2016 đến năm 2020 và một số dữ liệu về chi ngân sách nhà nước giai đoạn 2011 đến 2015 của 5 bộ và 3 tỉnh. Dữ liệu phân tích cho thấy chi cho thích ứng biến đổi khí hậu là chủ yếu, chiếm hơn 90% ngân sách cho biến đổi khí hậu, phù hợp với các ưu tiên chính sách của đầu tư công. Trong khi đó, chi cho các hoạt động giảm nhẹ chủ yếu từ khu vực tư nhân. Ngân sách cho biến đổi khí hậu trong giai đoạn từ năm 2016 đến năm 2020 của 6 bộ ổn định, chiếm khoảng từ 26 đến 38% tổng ngân sách của bộ. Bộ Nông nghiệp và Phát triển Nông thôn và Bộ Giao thông Vận tải chiếm phần lớn ngân sách cho biến đổi khí hậu với khoảng 80%, phần lớn dành cho hai nhiệm vụ biến đổi khí hậu, bao gồm thủy lợi và giao thông vận tải, chủ yếu là cơ sở hạ tầng. Ngân sách biến đổi khí hậu trung bình của 29 tỉnh, thành phố tăng đều trong khoảng thời gian từ 2016 đến 2020 và chiếm tỷ trọng tương đối ổn định trong tổng ngân sách của tỉnh, khoảng từ 16 đến 21%. Ngân sách biến đổi khí hậu của các tỉnh được tập trung cho các hành động cụ thể như lương thực, thực phẩm và nước, mực nước biển dâng và phát triển rừng. Ngân sách biến đổi khí hậu gắn với các hoạt động của chiến lược quốc gia về biến đổi khí hậu, cao hơn ngân sách gắn với các giải pháp của chiến lược tăng trưởng xanh và các nhiệm vụ của kế hoạch thực hiện thỏa thuận Paris. Do đó, cần điều chỉnh để gắn kết tốt hơn giữa các kế hoạch và ngân sách biến đổi khí hậu. Các thông tin của báo cáo rà soát đầu tư và chi tiêu công cho biến đổi khí hậu có thể được sử dụng nhằm đảm bảo sự phù hợp giữa ưu tiên ngân sách nhà nước với chính sách về biến đổi khí hậu trong hệ thống quản lý tài chính công và tăng cường các hành động liên quan đến khí hậu. Việc theo dõi và báo cáo chi ngân sách nhà nước cho biến đổi khí hậu rất hữu ích cho việc sửa đổi, bổ sung các chính sách về biến đổi khí hậu và huy động tài chính khí hậu từ các nguồn khác nhau. Các ưu tiên trong các chính sách biến đổi khí hậu với dự kiến tổng mức đầu tư và định hướng phân bổ ngân sách nhà nước cần được lồng ghép vào kế hoạch phát triển kinh tế xã hội 5 năm. Chi ngân sách cho biến đổi khí hậu cần được theo dõi và báo cáo một cách có hệ thống bởi các đơn vị đề xuất dự án ở tỉnh và bộ. Các cán bộ cần được tăng cường năng lực về chính sách biến đổi khí hậu và tăng trưởng xanh, cũng như tài chính khí hậu để thiết lập và triển khai hệ thống theo dõi tài chính khí hậu. Báo cáo rà soát đầu tư và chi tiêu công cho biến đổi khí hậu, thực hiện đánh giá chi ngân sách nhà nước cho biến đổi khí hậu của 6 bộ, bao gồm Bộ Công Thương, Bộ Giao thông Vận tải, Bộ Nông nghiệp và Phát triển Nông thôn, Bộ Tài nguyên và Môi trường, Bộ Xây dựng, Bộ Khoa học và Công nghệ, 28 tỉnh và thành phố Cần Thơ. Báo cáo bao gồm chi đầu tư và chi thường xuyên ngân sách nhà nước và hỗ trợ phát triển chính thức trong giai đoạn từ năm 2016 đến năm 2020 và một số dữ liệu về chi ngân sách nhà nước giai đoạn 2011 đến 2015 của 5 bộ và 3 tỉnh. Dữ liệu phân tích cho thấy chi cho thích ứng biến đổi khí hậu là chủ yếu, chiếm hơn 90% ngân sách cho biến đổi khí hậu, phù hợp với các ưu tiên chính sách của đầu tư công. Trong khi đó, chi cho các hoạt động giảm nhẹ chủ yếu từ khu vực tư nhân. Ngân sách cho biến đổi khí hậu trong giai đoạn từ năm 2016 đến năm 2020 của 6 bộ ổn định, chiếm khoảng từ 26 đến 38% tổng ngân sách của bộ. Bộ Nông nghiệp và Phát triển Nông thôn và Bộ Giao thông Vận tải chiếm phần lớn ngân sách cho biến đổi khí hậu với khoảng 80%, phần lớn dành cho hai nhiệm vụ biến đổi khí hậu, bao gồm thủy lợi và giao thông vận tải, chủ yếu là cơ sở hạ tầng. Ngân sách biến đổi khí hậu trung bình của 29 tỉnh, thành phố tăng đều trong khoảng thời gian từ 2016 đến 2020 và chiếm tỷ trọng tương đối ổn định trong tổng ngân sách của tỉnh, khoảng từ 16 đến 21%. Ngân sách biến đổi khí hậu của các tỉnh được tập trung cho các hành động cụ thể như lương thực, thực phẩm và nước, mực nước biển dâng và phát triển rừng. Ngân sách biến đổi khí hậu gắn với các hoạt động của chiến lược quốc gia về biến đổi khí hậu, cao hơn ngân sách gắn với các giải pháp của chiến lược tăng trưởng xanh và các nhiệm vụ của kế hoạch thực hiện thỏa thuận Paris. Do đó, cần điều chỉnh để gắn kết tốt hơn giữa các kế hoạch và ngân sách biến đổi khí hậu. Các thông tin của báo cáo rà soát đầu tư và chi tiêu công cho biến đổi khí hậu có thể được sử dụng nhằm đảm bảo sự phù hợp giữa ưu tiên ngân sách nhà nước với chính sách về biến đổi khí hậu trong hệ thống quản lý tài chính công và tăng cường các hành động liên quan đến khí hậu. Việc theo dõi và báo cáo chi ngân sách nhà nước cho biến đổi khí hậu rất hữu ích cho việc sửa đổi, bổ sung các chính sách về biến đổi khí hậu và huy động tài chính khí hậu từ các nguồn khác nhau. Các ưu tiên trong các chính sách biến đổi khí hậu với dự kiến tổng mức đầu tư và định hướng phân bổ ngân sách nhà nước cần được lồng ghép vào kế hoạch phát triển kinh tế xã hội 5 năm. Chi ngân sách cho biến đổi khí hậu cần được theo dõi và báo cáo một cách có hệ thống bởi các đơn vị đề xuất dự án ở tỉnh và bộ. Các cán bộ cần được tăng cường năng lực về chính sách biến đổi khí hậu và tăng trưởng xanh, cũng như tài chính khí hậu để thiết lập và triển khai hệ thống theo dõi tài chính khí hậu. Báo cáo rà soát đầu tư và chi tiêu công cho biến đổi khí hậu, thực hiện đánh giá chi ngân sách nhà nước cho biến đổi khí hậu của 6 bộ, bao gồm Bộ Công Thương, Bộ Giao thông Vận tải, Bộ Nông nghiệp và Phát triển Nông thôn, Bộ Tài nguyên và Môi trường, Bộ Xây dựng, Bộ Khoa học và Công nghệ, 28 tỉnh và thành phố Cần Thơ. Báo cáo bao gồm chi đầu tư và chi thường xuyên ngân sách nhà nước và hỗ trợ phát triển chính thức trong giai đoạn từ năm 2016 đến năm 2020 và một số dữ liệu về chi ngân sách nhà nước giai đoạn 2011 đến 2015 của 5 bộ và 3 tỉnh. Dữ liệu phân tích cho thấy chi cho thích ứng biến đổi khí hậu là chủ yếu, chiếm hơn 90% ngân sách cho biến đổi khí hậu.
Trực tiếp ở trên các
Program is streamlined on the digital platforms of UNDP in Vietnam, and thank you for joining us. And now you can make questions to the presenters and experts on the findings and result of the CPEIR report. And now we move to the discussion session. And now I would like to invite Mr. Viet Anh, the Director of Science and Technology Department of MPI, and Mr. Catalay Waysent, UNDP Resident Representative, to co-chair this plenary discussion session. Once again, I would like to express our thanks and appreciation to the three presenters. As we heard the presentation by three speakers, the findings and recommendations of the report that we heard today includes about overview about climate finance methodology, the trend of public investment and expenditure for climate change by ministries and provinces, as well as the links between ministerial and provincial budget to the priorities, actions, plans, and the tasks of the NCCS and National Green Growth Strategy and PIPA, as well as important recommendations to enhance the planning and climate finance tracking. I think that the findings and the information presented is critical to the planning, to the budgeting, monitoring, and reporting for climate budget. So with that in mind, I think that your inputs and comments are quite crucial so that we can take advantage of the findings and the report, to further enhance the efficiency of the climate finance. And now I would like to open the floor for all participants. If you have any questions or comments, you can make questions to the chat box, or you can raise your hands to ask questions so that we would direct your questions to the speakers so that we can better understand about the report as well as to take advantage of the use of the report. So please feel free to share your comments or ask questions. Thank you. Co-chairs, my name is Ba from the MART, and in the board talk a lot about the MART budget for climate change. So I would like to share my comments about the methodology in order to ensure the data quality as well as on the recommendations. Here from the MART, according to us, the report said that there are two methodologies, international methodologies and MPI's methodology. I think that each methodology has pros and cons. From our view, it doesn't matter what methodology it is, but with our experience and currently UNDP is helping the MART to conduct the in-depth analysis on public expenditure for climate change, doing the data analysis on the database, and through practical experiences, we would like to contribute some inputs as follows to the report. First of all, I think that in order to ensure the sustainability of data quality and data reliability, I think that data analysis instead of consultants collecting data from ministries for the report, I think that in the future we should move towards to that consultants provide trainings and guidance for staff of ministries so that they can do their own data analysis, because we are those who directly engage in this. It's not difficult because I think that we know about the project and which the project belongs to which categories in climate change response. So that is my first recommendation. And secondly, we are now in the digital transformation. So I think that for the methodology, we need to do classification using on the database so it can enhance the data sharing, data analysis. You know that because we may have different requirements. We are very requirement to collect data from the assigned tasks, and some requirements requires us to take data from the disbursement or from the plant. So that is the second recommendation. And the next is that about the data quality. Actually, we have worked with consultants. We basically agree with the methodology, and we think that data quality is okay. But of course, when we worked with consultants, when we did the in-depth analysis, we look at the components of the project, because in a big project, there are some components in the project and some components are not related to the climate change. So there is a small difference about the data, but this is not really important. And the next issue is that here you analyze the annual data, but according to me, when we compare, we need to compare by periods of 5 years, because for any one data, sometimes it does not truly reflect the situation. For example, for the midterm investment plan, for the first year, we disburse a little bit less amount, and the subsequent years, we disburse a lot. So if we compare any one data, if we are not the insider, it will be very difficult for outsiders to understand. So you need to consider the comparison of 5-year period rather than any one data. And another issue is that when we talk about expenditure for climate change, there are two categories of expenditure, including state budget expenditure and provincial expenditure and private expenditure. If we look at these two expenditure categories, we can have a full picture about the expenditure for climate change. For example, here in the report, you say that irrigation transport has a higher budget allocation, but of course irrigation and transport play a role in economic development, and we can see blurry other sectors. But I think that when you look at expenditure by sectors, you need to look at sectors that has a lower budget allocation. For example, forestry or sustainable agriculture, using different methods in reducing emission in livestock and crop production. So if you need to look at other sectors instead of looking at the amount of money, and we can look at which sectors receive a less budget allocation, so that we can provide orientation or direction for prioritize for budget allocation. So in brief, I think that through our experience, because from the MART, in terms of investment, we received the second budget allocation, but for a number of projects, we have the most number of projects. For example, for the period 2016 and 2020, we have 400 projects, and in terms of components, we have 1,000 components. So through our practical experience, that is the input that we can share with you as a comment as well as input, so that you can, and I think that this kind of report should be conducted on a more regular basis. And in your recommendations, you said that to develop reporting on climate expenditure system. So I think that we need to integrate in the existing reporting tool in order to reduce the reporting burden, and when integrated data would be consistent among different sectors to avoid the situation that different agencies are reporting on the same issues, but these issues are not consistent. Thank you, Mr. Ba. Please allow me to respond quickly to your question, and then I pass on the floor to Mr. Kathleen Wilson and speakers to respond to what you said. I think that what you raised were quite valuable for us to look how we can use this report for the methodology. I think that the two presenters, Mr. Kuhn and Mr. Kuvnizif, would respond to his question about the methodology. And for data analysis, I agree with Mr. Ba, because Mr. Ba is working in the MAT who use the most of budget for climate change. So besides data analysis, experts, I agree, can train on data collection and analysis, because I think that of course, experts has a lot of experience, so that you can train them on data collection and analysis, not only staff at central, but also at local levels. And next one is about data quality. You can see clearly that data is the most challenging part in this analysis, because data system in Vietnam is not standardized, because we have managed data manually for many years and keep records manually. That's why data is not of good quality. However, I think that the findings of the report are basically accurate, but in terms of the findings about detailed analysis, because we do not have a detailed data, so I think so moving forward, like Mr. Ba said, that for the public investment system, so for now it is managed digitally, and moving forward, if the report continue to be conducted, moving forward, of course, data quality would be improved. And another suggestion about 5-year comparison instead of annual comparison. I think that I agree with you, because in 1 year they may fluctuate or vary significantly. This year maybe 16, or next year 13, or next another year 14 trillion VNT. So I know that there is a challenge in data collection. So I think that moving forward, and if we continue with the report and then to support the budget allocation, I think that it is necessary to do the 5-year comparison. And regarding the public expenditure, private expenditure, and you advise to analyze not only irrigation but agriculture but other sectors. I agree, because when we have resources, we need to do deeper analysis on sectors or subsectors. Maybe there is a less budget that we overlook to analyze it, but if we had resources, we need to also look at these subsectors, especially for climate change. So those are my quick responses. Thank you, Mr. Ba, for your inputs, and I think that your inputs would significantly contribute to help to deepen and to gear how to utilize this report, not only for researches but also for capacity building and for policy development. And thank you. And now I would like to pass on the floor to Ms. Kathleen Wilson and the speakers.
Thank you very much. A very interesting exchange. What I would highlight, I think before passing over to Koos and our other colleagues here who are the experts on the methodology questions, is another question we've received online. And this is, it would be interesting to know the scale of the project baselines, the number of projects that were used for the analysis. In addition, does the report also identify areas of climate finance gaps in relation to the climate change mitigation and adaptation objectives embedded in the National Climate Change Strategy and Green Growth Strategies, as well as the Power Plan? And this is from Ivan Lawrence White. So maybe I will add that to the list of questions and pass over to Koos in the first instance, as you're here in the room. Thank you.
I think my colleagues here will also comment on the methodology, but let me say a few things in response to Mr. Ba, as well as the online question and comment that you just referred to. First is that our recommendations are very clearly that there has to be capacity building of officials, such as in the Ministry of Agriculture, and that self-analysis is the preferred future, because you are completely right. You know, and therefore you should analyze. So very much within our recommendations. The fact that you are referring to the MTIP, the multi-year investment planning, yes, everybody knows there will be fluctuations, first year less expenditure, and multi-year analysis is absolutely critical. This is different for recurrent expenditure. So we do need to consider that as well. So investment and recurrent is different. Looking into other sectors, again, I strongly agree with the Ministry of Planning and Investment that it is important to look in depth at some of the sectors where there is less expenditure. This exercise cannot go into the depth of any sector or subsector. So again, that would be within the purview of an individual ministry or province to do that. But we have tried to point out some of the let's call it weaknesses or challenges in some of the links between the budget data that we found and some of the sectors. On scale of projects, I think Mr. Kuong and the two of you can communicate much better than me. On financial gaps, you can also maybe make a comment on that.
Tôi còn xin có một số ý.
I would like to respond quickly regarding the methodology as well as the data collection training for the methodology. Why did we use the old methodology of 2015 CPEIR report, but why don't we use the new methodology? First of all, about the scale and the scope of data collection for this report is very large. Just imagine 6 ministries and 28 provinces. So with the MPI's methodology, which requires the detailed data analysis down to the project level and each project item. So with thousands of projects and for detailed analysis and within the scope of the study with the limited resources, we couldn't analyze the detailed project items. That's why we selected the old methodology. And secondly, we would like to compare the two studies and scale up the study, because the last study was done for 2010 and 2015, and the new study was for 2016 and 2020. If we use the same methodology, we would have time series data on public expenditure for 2010 and 2020. So those are the questions for the methodology. And we think that moving forward, if we conduct CPEIR in the future, by that time data would be improved. And in our comments, we would expect that once we do the next CPEIR, we would do the quoting from the initial step of the study, so that the CPEIR review would not be the retrospective like this. We would have the online data available, but now for us, for data collection, we have a list of projects. We have a list of documents in the spreadsheet form, and some project has a PDF files. Of course, it's a time consuming, but I think that it was partially digitized. So those are the two responses quickly to the questions about methodology and data collection. I would like to add one more point to answer your question when you asked about the data collection, data analysis on the investment, and you mentioned about period comparison rather than annual comparison. We agree. However, as we see that if we had only 2 5-year period, 2010, 2015, and 2016 and 2020, and for there is a lot of data gap for the period 2010 and 2015. So for multiple year comparison, it may not ensure the accuracy. That is the reason why we focus on the period 2016 and 2020. And during that period, because we did annual comparison, because we do not have many 5-year periods to compare. And secondly, as indicated in the report, we focused on public investment, but our expectation is to look at the public expenditure, including recurrent expenditure. For current expenditure, we had the data of 3 ministries and some provinces only. So later on, if we have a comprehensive picture to analyze expenditure and recurrent, we can combine we would analyze annually and for the same period, so that we would have a clearer picture about recurrent expenditure. Yeah, thank you. I received 2 questions from Mr. Thang from Isponre. And the first question, he would like to ask why you only do the study in 29 provinces, but not 63 provinces, and cover all ministries, so that it would have a full pictures. And the second question, how did you analyze expenditure for climate change or socio-economic development? For example, how do you distinguish project? For example, in the transport infrastructure project, how do you break down the expenditure for socio-economic development and budget for climate change in the transport infrastructure projects? Thank you.
Okay, I will start again, and I will start the explanation, and then maybe my colleagues here can add to it. Why not 63 provinces and all ministries? Our human resources were limited, and we felt that the 29 was already a major improvement over the past. We have spread those provinces all over the country, and it includes all 13 provinces and Kanto City in the Mekong Delta, because there were also data from that region already analyzed by the GIZ together with these provinces. But of course, if you do all provinces and all ministries, that would be better. The analysis as to how we decide whether it is socio-economic development or climate change, or how much of this and how much of that, this is a very difficult question in the methodology. So as Jeremy and Kuong have explained a bit, maybe Kuong can explain more, but we allocate a share of each individual project to climate change or not climate change, not 100%. It's in fact rarely 100%. This is done according to certain definitions that have been agreed in the methodology, and we have tried to do the same thing this time compared to 7 years ago. But we have to acknowledge that this is fairly simplistic, and this judgment is often done by a local finance officer in a ministry or in a province, but only based on title, not based on in-depth study of the concerned investment project. Again, that is what the methodology has been agreed to be. But of course, if you go into further depth, you will get a much better judgment. Again, that is limited to our resources. But maybe you want to add to it?
I would like to add to what Kut just explained. The classification of socio-economic development projects to see which projects are related to climate change and what is the level of relation to climate change. We are based on the methodologies of CPEIR 2014, where there was a certain definition and description for example, these categories of project are classified related to climate change, either adaptation or mitigation, or if the project has these objectives, the weight related to climate change is higher than other projects, etc. So in the methodology of 2014, there was a definition, and we follow this definition and technology of 2014. However, the constraints like Kuz just presented, we had the ambition that for the project, if we have the project names, if we have the description of that project, we would understand better about the project, and the classification by the experience of the expert would have a higher reliability. But actually, in fact, we could collect the project names only. Yeah. So to increase the reliability of data, we also took additional steps. For example, experts would follow 2014 guideline for pre-classification, and then we sent back this data to provinces or ministries that we have worked with, so that ministries would review, and if any unclarity existed, staff in charge in ministries and provinces worked with us and reviewed the projects that was not that had the gap or that was not consistent. So those are the additional steps that we took in order to minimize the to reduce the subjectivity of the expert. So just like Viet Anh said earlier, the consultant teams looked at the data to analyze the trend. We did not have a detailed data to deeper analyze for each project or for each site. Yeah, thank you. And another reason why we selected 29 provinces and 6 ministries. Why not all ministries and all provinces? Because there are many reasons. The first reason is that previously we selected provinces which are most vulnerable to climate change and provinces that we are implementing projects. And you know that for the review of public expenditure and investment for climate change is complicated in the methodology, complicated in the data. So to have a standardized methodology for wider application is a step that we improving in order to have a standardized methodology. So yeah, and because each province have a different uniqueness or special features, that's why we selected these 29 provinces who spend more for climate change. Those are 13 Mekong Delta provinces or Central Highlands or North Central regions, which has a long coastline and which is vulnerable to climate change, and to have a comprehensive picture on climate expenditure. There is a large expenditure disbursed by the private sector. So ideally, we would like to have a full picture. However, actually, to do that, we have to do stepwise approach. Tôi nghĩ rằng
in our team, she is online and she would like to also respond to Mr. Ba. So can the technical people get Mrs. Nguyen to speak?
Hello. Can you hear me? Yeah. Vâng, chúng tôi nghe được chị nói đấy ạ. Thank you. And thank you, co-chairs, for giving me an opportunity to talk. And even I cannot join in person, I am a member of the consultant team, and I was directly in charge of the MART. So I would like to respond to Mr. Ba's question. Mr. Ba's inputs sounds excellent. There are some issues as follow when we worked with the MART. Like many other ministries, we collected a list of public investment, and this list may be related to climate change. It may not be related to climate change, but those are the list that was in the midterm investment plan. For example, 2016 to 2020, and agricultural sector is a sector which manage the data very well. So we receive a very good support from you. So and on data was reviewed, and we presented to you the data review process already. And when we talk about climate expenditure, climate change is a intersectoral issues or cross-cutting issue. And it is not like our TAPMIT system. For example, classification in 13 sectors: education, healthcare, culture, transport. Those are similar sectors that are in our traditional classification system. And we are classifying by sectors compatible to international classification. However, climate expenditure is a cross-cutting issue in education, for example, to address climate change, for example, to train, to deliver trainings on climate change. So we also consider that it is 100% for climate change, for example, like Mr. Thang said about transport. In transport sector, if it is in the national targeted program on climate change, it means that on the objectives of the transport projects, we consider them as 100% climate change related. But the difficult part is that if we cannot identify the objective of climate change in other projects. How can we determine the proportion related to climate change? As our colleagues explained, we, honestly speaking, we need to work with line ministries and provincial departments or DPIs, those who had good knowledge, for example, about one transport project, to work with them to identify if this project was located in which site or the site is vulnerable to climate change, but we had only the name of the project, which is not enough to convince that if it is 100% or 50% or 50% climate change related. After our preliminary classification, we had to come back to work with ministries and provinces. And it is an issue that because classifying for climate change, it is unlike a healthcare and education. There is a clearly defined definition, but here we are based on literature, and the literature is compatible with UNDP and the World Bank, and it was piloted in 2014 and within the narrow scope. But this year we expand to 29 provinces. So Kus explained that due to limited resources. But coming back to the issue, we would like the report will be conducted on a regular basis and systematically, as Mr. Viet Anh just said. And for example, the definition about climate change related, we need to work in details about that. And then for a project, for a transport project, how can we classify a transport project? Without climate change, we would implement A action, but due to climate change, we would take B action, and then B action is greater than A action, and then if we minus A minus B, it's very difficult to convince people about that. But however, we need to take stock. There is no choice. There is no way. So with this stock taking, this methodology was accepted by UNDP and the World Bank in the first CPEIR report, and then we follow this methodology to compare between different periods. That's why we use the old methodology instead of using MPI 2017 methodology. I think that in fact MPI's methodology looks good, but it is very difficult in practice to define. So if we had used MPI's methodology, we could have not been able to compare with the previous report. So those are what we are starting with this journey. Of course, there are certain weaknesses and gaps. It is not a complete report, as we said earlier. Of course, the report would not be a complete report that and this need to be further improved. But I think that our expectation is that the report should be mainstreamed systematically, and it should be incorporated in the budgeting, and we can use a tablet of the treasury. And it is a journey, and it requires MPI, Ministry of Finance, and the government need to provide direction so that we hopefully that we can have a methodology how we can code this expenditure in the system, because you see that in 5 years time I would think that we would have a very systematic methodology. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that comprehensive response, and I think we have time for one more question. And this is coming from the Support Planning and Implementation of NAMA, or the Nationally Appropriate Mitigation Actions Project. I think this is JICA, from JICA funding. And the question is, for the next round of CPEIR, starting with the 2021 budget cycle, if MPI/UNDP would plan to quantify the green part of the recovery expenditure. If so, how would you approach methodologically? So interesting question, and I will ask Kus to take the first cut at that.
First is to say that, again, our recommendation is that, yes, we will move towards both a regular monitoring system of finance, and that should somehow track, label and track what is green and what is climate change. But we also recommend that that will be introduced in a gradual manner. This is such a massive requirement, such a massive operation concerning budgets at all levels and sectors, that you cannot expect that to be immediate. So the answer to your question is yes, but hang on, we are not there yet. These are currently recommendations and they need to be implemented. A second point I want to make, which is tangentially related, is that, and what we have not presented today, is a recommendation to consider what we call off-budget public expenditure on climate change. This is not part of our current exercise. We have not considered this. What is off-budget? Well, it is still government expenditure, but it is through special funds, for example. So, for example, the Viet Nam Environmental Protection Fund. But it is also about tax reduction. So if the government sets a policy to reduce import tax for certain green goods, equipment for renewable energy or something like that, it reduces the tax, then that is essentially a public expenditure. And that needs to be tracked as well. So what is that type of expenditure? We don't know. If you talk about a very special effort, a special allocation, such as COVID recovery, and that special budget is in addition to normal recurrent and investment budgets, that would somehow fall into this category, or the category of the two types of expenditure that I'm talking about. So although we have not written about COVID in our report, most certainly we would support the idea that these kinds of special efforts would be monitored and would be presented a few years later in terms of potential learning for the next steps. Not sure whether my colleagues want to say something. Tum or Kung, you want to add?
Thank you very much. I think the question was well answered. Okay, so I think that that brings us to a close for today. I think there were many questions, very good questions, by the way. Thank you very much for the active engagement. And I won't try to be summarizing all of these, but I did want to just pull out one or two highlights, key takeaways. And I think one of our key messages here and from the finding from the report is that, yes, Vietnam has increasingly allocated its financial resources for climate change response. And this momentum should be continued and even accelerated. And this is it also underscores at the same time, while Vietnam is doing its part, there's international support needed for the other dimensions as well. And this is for both the adaptation, where most of the expenditure has gone, and also for the mitigation. The second is in terms of the importance of, as we move forward, aligning to the new commitments that have been made. So looking at how we can more proactively look forward in terms of linking the budgets and budget tagging and coding in ways that are going to be more proactive rather than retrospective. I think the other message that we have is the alignment of the climate budget with the climate change and green growth priorities and strategies, that these need to be monitored very carefully. And I think, and adjusted in a much more regular way and in a more systematic way. Finally, I think in terms of ways forward, we've heard really good suggestions on some CPEIR forward-looking styles for how to adjust some of the methodology in terms of moving forward, how to enhance the climate responsiveness of the public financial management system, how this can possibly be, how we can better possibly integrate climate change and green growth strategies and plans into sectors and province plans, and allocation of climate change budget strategies at early planning stages. So I think these are all very, very important to bear in mind. Then we've had the interesting discussion about what's on budget and what's off budget, and that these are extremely important, and it would be good to have a whole of expenditure picture, a whole of finance picture, and that should be an aspiration that we look forward to. And just to say extend our great thanks to the Ministry of Planning and Investment and to all the ministries who've engaged in this process. It's been quite intensive and quite laborious, but very rewarding, I think, and to all the provinces who've been actively engaged. And that as we continue forward, and as the the rigors for climate financing and budgeting become more stringent, that these coding and budget coding and tracking will be extremely important, and even more so than it has been in the past, particularly as Vietnam continues to compete for ever increasingly smaller global resources that are available for the impressive climate change adaptation needs of the country and to meet the needs of its people, for both adaptation and mitigation. But as we said, mitigation drawing also largely on private sector contribution. I think the work of this on the climate change adaptation really lays a strong foundation for Vietnam building the case for being a strong, transparent partner, encouraging further international sources of financing, which has been used very productively and well, and to continue to address the very significant concerns that there are in this country, and in ways that will leave nobody behind. So I just would like to thank everyone for their contribution. I'd like to thank our experts for all their hard work, and the ministries and the provinces, and to my co-chair as well. Thank you very much. Xin cảm ơn.
Xin cảm ơn bà.
Thank you, Ms. Kathleen Wilson, for summary of our today's workshop and what were discussed about the findings of the report. I think that I expect that online participants would have more comments and questions. I request that the Secretariat synthesize those reports, and if reports are related to any speakers, you need to direct those questions to speakers for answers and for clarification and for providing more additional information about the report. And I echo Mr. Kathleen Wilson to summarize the workshop. As a focal agency in collaboration with UNDP to deliver this report. And once again, I would like to extend my thanks to all of you for your time to join our today's launching workshop. And I extend my appreciation to participants for your valuable inputs and on the topics that we are all concerned, especially in the context that we need to have breakthrough solutions in order to fulfill our international commitments that we made to the international community, especially in the context of COVID. And you know that Vietnam reflects our strong determination in responding to climate change, in making ambitious and strong commitments which were made by our Prime Minister in COP26, which was highly appreciated by the international community about net zero emission target. And we are aware that Vietnam is a developing country. Besides complying and implementing climate change targets, the government also have to promote and achieve socio-economic development targets, especially green growth targets, with given difficulties faced by COVID-19 in recovery, as well as in the geopolitical situation in the world. And Vietnam would face major challenges to sustain our achievements, as well as to fulfill our commitments that we made. And for this, our report indicates that despite the significant investment for climate change, However, the climate finance needs of Vietnam is quite substantial, and I would like to reiterate what was said by our Prime Minister. There should be justice and just in the needs for climate finance, which means that developed countries have a developed and they should share responsible for compensating for developing countries, for providing climate finance for developing countries. And ladies and gentlemen, Vietnam is implementing SDP, 5 years SDP and green growth strategy. And Vietnam determines that this is a very decisive period for implementing, achieving targets in responding to climate change. So from this report, as well as from the synthesis of implementation of strategies, we are aware that moving forward, Vietnam need to focus on issues as follows. First, we need to implement effectively the tasks and solutions in the 10-year, 5-year SDP, especially we need to take into account climate change and COVID pandemic. And secondly, we need to mobilize and use effectively the resources from private sector, as we found in the report, the CSO and NGO, and we emphasize the effective use of the resources because some resources were not used effectively. And I agree with the recommendations of the report that we need to build capacity on climate public expenditure investment capacity, planning capacity of ministries and provinces. And we need to raise awareness and build capacity of staff on climate change and green growth. And fifthly, we need to mainstream climate change and green growth in the overall plans. As we receive a question, how we break down, and it is a very important issue moving forward. And finally, I agree with the recommendations of the report, that is that we need to develop and finalize the comprehensive monitoring and reporting system of climate public expenditure and investment, so that we can break down the data and based on that we need to apply digital transformation. Because my view is that this is a fact-finding study. It is not the in-depth analysis for policy recommendation. So we need to have a better quality so that data so that we can do that. And for the findings of the report, the findings from the report need to be prioritized to further study and implemented moving forward in order to take advantage of findings and recommendations of the report that we discussed today. And those are very important values that the report brings about. And that is a short summary from what we discussed today. And we conclude the workshop here. And I wish you good health, success, and happiness. Thank you very much. And thank you, Ms. Katalin Wilson, for successfully chairing our today's workshop. And thank you, all participants. Thank you, Mr. Viet Anh, Director of Science, Technology, Education, Natural Resource, Environment Department of MPI, and Ms. Katalin Wilson, UNDP Resident Representative to Vietnam. Ladies and gentlemen, within 2.5 hours, we have successfully delivered the workshop covering important aspects of the report, especially the discussion session is very useful with the participation of scientists, researchers from provinces, and we receive active participation of online participants through live stream platforms of UNDP. Thank you, in-person participants as well as online participant journalists and reporters for broadcasting the news of the workshop. I hope that the findings of the report would be further analyzed, reviewed, and deepened by own audience for the common goal to better combat climate change. And goodbye, and looking forward to meeting you again in the subsequent events.